Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Crimsonland. This is a top-down dual-stick style shooter that was developed by 10 Tons Limited and originally released in 2003 for PC. And it got re-released last year, 2014, for a variety of systems. Of course PC, but also Linux, PS3, PS Vita, PS4, Mac, all sorts of things like that. And the new version features things like Steam integration and, of course, new content. And I actually was provided a copy of the game by the developer. They were like, hey, could you take a look at our game and see about getting a video up? They actually sent this to me during the Humble Bundle that included this, so I do apologize for not getting this video out sooner. But now that we're here, let's go ahead and talk about the game itself. Now, I remember playing this back in maybe 2004, I think it was, but I didn't really play any more than the demo, and I only played a bit of that, so I don't really have a very strong memory of the original release. What I do remember is basically just like this. I do know there were some changes between the original release and the new release, not just the fact that this thing has some additional content, but I'm not entirely certain on those changes because I didn't have the full version of the original game. So there might be somebody in the comments section that can tell you more about that. But suffice to say, this game is not really intense on the presentation side of things, other than the fact that it's just really, really bloody. They have a 2D top-down perspective, and everything is sprite work. And it's pretty decent sprite work, although the animations themselves are fairly simplistic and you're not going to see a lot of complexity to really anything in this thing. They just have some fairly bright and colorful stuff gone in there. There's a lot of color swap enemies, so you're going to find that that's fairly samey throughout. But other than that, everything looks fine. It's not particularly amazing or anything like that, but it's serviceable for what they're going for, which is a lot of enemies on screen at once. And because it's top-down perspective, they can actually get away with that a lot easier. Now, that's not to say the game looks bad. It doesn't, but it's just very simplistic. The one thing they do throw in there that is fairly major is the sheer amount of blood in this thing. When you kill something, it bleeds everywhere, and by the end of a level, you're basically going to have the entire map completely drenched in blood. So that's kind of amusing, but other than that, it's not a particularly huge effect on the overall presentation, although it does give the name Crimsonland some actual sense. As far as the sound design goes, they don't really have particularly great sound effects. They work, and that's about all I can say for them. They're just kind of there, and while they're better than having nothing, they aren't particularly memorable or really all that exciting. There's also some music to go along with that, but it's frankly entirely forgettable. In fact, I pretty much turned it off because I just kind of got tired of listening to it and just substituted my own soundtrack, so it's not something that really works in the game's favor. And there's not really any voice acting to speak of, but the character sounds upon dying and the various enemies upon dying make various kind of silly groaning noises and such like that. So that does cheese things up a bit and give it a bit of charm. But then we ultimately come to the story, or complete lack thereof. There is no story in this thing. And the gameplay. And the gameplay is a pretty standard top-down dual-stick shooter kind of thing, where on the PC anyway, you move around with the keyboard and you aim and fire with the mouse. Obviously on console you're going to be using two different analog sticks for that, but it really does just come down to the simplicity of move around, shoot stuff, try not to die. If you're expecting much nuance in this thing, or an actual storyline or anything like that, you're not going to get it. What you get are various quests, so to speak, where you have 6 chapters in the Steam re-release, and each of these has 10 levels, where it just gives you different challenges to complete without any of the perks or anything like that to help you out. And all of these ultimately just become kill off waves of enemies until there are none remaining and you win. And that just persists throughout the entirety of the game. When you go to the other modes, they're basically just different spins on that. Survival mode, you're just trying to survive as long as you can against waves of enemies. But in this particular instance, you get access to the perks and any unlockable weapon. Now, when you're playing through the game, you're going to see that occasionally an enemy will drop something upon dying. You get a variety of power-ups, and these power-ups will give you different things. You can get something that shoots out a bunch of plasma bolts. You can get something that slows down time so you can move a lot easier and aim quicker. There's one to replenish your health. There's ones that will give you rapid fire, all sorts of things like that. And these power-ups will be of varying use to you throughout the course of the game. Sometimes they're really helpful, sometimes they're not very helpful, and you really just need to pick the power-ups up that really are going to help you out in any given situation, as you would pretty much expect. That said, these are different from the perks. The perks are things you unlock upon leveling up. Now, as you go through the quests, you're going to unlock all sorts of different weapons, all sorts of different perks, and these are going to be playable in the survival mode, where you're basically just going to continue killing enemies until eventually you level up and you get a selection of perks. And these perks can be anything from just, instead of running out of ammo when you actually run out of ammo, it starts draining your health instead. Or things like you do damage to things around you in a passive sense, all sorts of things that are very, very useful, and a few things that aren't quite as useful. But mostly it's going to be pretty useful stuff, and as you continue leveling up, you're going to be getting access to more and more perks that all pretty much stack on each other. So there is a definite sense of progression with regards to the perks in the survival mode, but as far as the weapons go, it's just a crapshoot. You're going to kill an enemy and then it's going to drop a weapon, and you're not entirely sure what that weapon's going to be. It could be something from a submachine gun to a shotgun to a plasma chain gun kind of thing, all sorts of things like that. And these are going to be of varying uses to you as you play through the game. Because sometimes you're going to be going up against a lot of massed enemies, and you're probably going to want something like a rocket launcher. Whereas other times, you're not really concerned about that, you're more concerned about volume of fire, in which case a minigun or an assault rifle works. And then on occasion, you'll find that one weapon you really don't like using, and you'll be working basically just to replace that with something you do actually like using. And the cycle just kind of repeats. Now, there are modes beyond just the survival mode and the quest mode, and those are unlockable. Now, one of them is rush mode, where you're basically just given the assault rifle and you're supposed to hold out against waves of enemies without anything to give you a bonus. So that's basically the try-hard mode, so to speak. And all of it is very, very simplistic and built around the exact same idea. Here are a bunch of enemies that are going to come at you all at once. You need to fend them off. That is all. It's ultimately a very, very simple game. And ultimately, whether or not you're going to like it is going to come down to whether you like what it does. It's, again, very simplistic and very repetitive. I mean, I've only played this thing for a couple of hours, but I feel like I've gotten about all I'm going to get out of it. It eventually does ramp up the difficulty pretty considerably during the quest mode, and the survival mode just continually ramps up the difficulty. So you're probably going to hit a brick wall at some point, and that's exactly what happened with me. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, it's just not really my thing. It does have local co-op, but that's the problem. It's local co-op. What it really would need to actually be pretty interesting for PC is to have online co-op in addition to the local co-op. So that's something they could think about doing for a future version or something like that. But again, it's very repetitive, it's very simplistic, and if you go in expecting anything other than that, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed. And to be fair, this is a re-release of a game from 2003, and back when it came out, this was actually more complicated than a lot of the games of this type, so it won a lot of points for that. And now that it's about 11 years later, in this case it's about 12 years later, the game itself ends up being kind of old-fashioned, if that makes sense. So if that's what you're looking for, you'll probably be able to get something out of Crimsonland. If you're not really into the whole twin-stick shooter or the idea of just fending off waves and waves and waves of enemies until you win kind of thing, then you're probably not really going to get much of anything out of Crimsonland. And I do have to say that their price for this thing is $14 on Steam. That's a bit high for something like this. I mean, if I look at the various top-down shooters on Steam, the top sellers are mostly things in the $10 or less price range. And on occasion you'll find something that's more than that, but not very often. So if this thing kind of strikes your fancy, then you might want to wait for a sale or another Humble Bundle or something like that and see about checking it out then. But it's kind of hard to recommend at its current price point of about $14. Especially when twin-stick shooters are actually pretty commonplace these days and offer different spins on the genre than this thing did, which is basically just a bunch of weapons, some of which are actually really fun to use, admittedly, and a bunch of perks. And that's kind of it. And some of them have online co-op and things like that. So that is something you do have to keep in mind when you're looking at Crimsonland. But it's not a bad game by any means. If you like this sort of thing, you'll probably be able to get something out of it. Thanks for watching.